For my day job, I work at the Hana Center, which is a Korean American, we say immigrant rights and access or social services organizing and advocacy organization here in Chicago. So I'm our deputy director, and so my main focus of my role, among others, is to really support our programs to deeply embody our mission of immigrant justice. So I find my whole job extremely rewarding. I think for me, it's really enjoyable and a wonderful experience to work in the Korean community as a Korean adoptee, and to be able to support not only other adoptees, but the larger Korean American community, particularly in a time like now where we're living in the midst of a pandemic. And so many people have many needs. We're able to advocate on many levels for our community to have the support that they need. And for the people who are most impacted by injustice, whether it's because of language barriers, documentation, income, age, or any other reason, to make sure that their rights are protected during a time like this. So I was first adopted when I was 3 months old. I don't have a lot of information about my own, kind of like situation or my story before that. But what I do know is that there's a likelihood that my adoptive mother is still alive and that I have a brother. So that's kind of the beginning of my story as much as I know. And that I came out of Cheongju City in South Korea and ended up at Holt, an adoption agency. And so I was then matched with a family living in the US in New Jersey, the Jennings family, which is where my last name comes from. And I was adopted when I was 3 months old. So between that time, I lived with a foster family, I think most of the first 3 months of my life. And then I got on a plane with some social workers and ended up, I think, at the Newark airport or JFK. And so my family got me, and they had one child already, who's my older sister, Natasha, and she's white, as are both of my adoptive parents. And we grew up in New Jersey, and a pretty diverse area that had a lot of Asians, which I think my parents did intentionally, I have found out. So that I would be around other Asians, and also they just happened to live in the New York, New Jersey area, which there's tons of Asians, and other folks. So I grew up in a pretty ethnically, and in a lot of other ways, very, very diverse part of this country. So my parents told me a story that's pretty typical for people who are adopted from Korea, which is that they could not have a child biologically. My father had cancer, and so they started looking at adoption. And then something that is also very typical is that while they were going through this process, they had my sister. And then since they had already started, they decided to continue and adopt a child. That's mostly my dad's story. My mom will also add in that probably more of like a faith perspective, some kind of, she felt led to do it, which is also very common with a lot of adoption stories. I think one thing I like about them is they're very smart. My parents were very smart, and they're very hardworking, and so they taught me those values. And they're people who believe in doing your best, and they set a standard that's higher than do your best, though. It's like do your best of your best of your best. But they set that mostly by example. So I appreciate those values from my parents. I always knew I was adopted. This was in the kind of area that I grew up in. It was very racially diverse, and even if no one had told me, it would have come out pretty quickly that I was adopted. So I've never not known. And I've always known that I was Korean and my family was white. So I think it's more emphatic for me, meaning it's something that I never really questioned in some sense. I never had to go through oh, I just found out I've been adopted moment. I would say that probably yes, I was treated differently, but it's hard to really unpack, I think in this moment, what what that means. And I think all children are treated differently by their parents for different reasons. So I think my parents made the best effort that they thought that they could to treat us equally, in the sense of like equal rights and equal allowance and stuff like that. I think what was actually more striking, that's very typical for an adoptee, is that it's the way I wasn't treated differently that stands out to me. So I didn't really learn very much about my Korean culture and heritage growing up. I went to an adoptee camp one year and did a little bit, but I didn't really, I didn't go to Korean school or, on the weekend when other people I knew did, right? And so there were things that I didn't do because I was treated the same way as my sister that were actually in some ways part of who I am. And looking back, I don't know if I would have been willing to do them, but I do think that was a piece of me that I didn't explore when I was a kid. As an adoptee, growing up in the kind of environment I did, I had a different experience than a lot of adoptees, where I had Korean friends, and I had a white family, and then I had a lot of other folks in my life. And so I think for me, there was confusion early on regarding my race and my ethnicity and the expectations of the Koreans in my life versus the expectations of my white family. So early on as a child, I remember as a peer feeling pressured by my Korean friends and peers to go and exclusively be with the Koreans. And I think because they were children, they didn't understand the concept that I had a white family, and because of that, my psychology was different. And I wouldn't feel normal about only hanging out with other Koreans. And so I resisted that a lot, and I remember having conflicts with some of my Korean peers over my lack of knowledge about Korean culture or my lack of desire to kind of choose Koreans before others. And then I would say in my white family, my family didn't necessarily understand why I had so many friends who were Asian or non-white. So that's a bit of a unique experience for an adoptee, I think. But given where I grew up, it's probably more typical in high immigrant contexts. I have not. I have not met my biological parents. I've tried. I've gone through a birth search process. However, the laws in Korea, in my case, still favor the privacy of the birth parent over the right of the adoptee to know their lineage and history. And so I believe that I have a biological mother who's still alive, and like I said, a brother. However, I have not met them. I was with my Korean American friend, and her family had agreed for me to come with her. And so that was my first experience going back to Korea. So I think first landing, I just remember feeling tired and like the gray area around Incheon as we're driving into Seoul at like 5 a.m. in the morning. But I think in a more expanded way, that journey, that trip, was really disorienting for me. And I think not speaking Korean and being surrounded by people who only spoke Korean, having, again, those messages of like, you have to have more pride in your Koreanness, and me feeling like I really don't like identify completely with whatever is underneath all of this, and really not having a lot of knowledge or grounding at the time in my own Korean adoptee experiences. I think that was all very challenging. The one thing I did like was, I think because I'd always identified racially as an ethnic, like in a racialized sense as very much Korean, being surrounded by other Koreans for the first time in my life felt really good. So even though I had this cultural disidentification and realizing how different my experiences were that had shaped me and the experiences of most Koreans, I felt really good about myself, I think just like racially for probably the first time in my life. I think I felt beautiful for the first time in my life, and truly like in a rooted way. Like I'm with others like me, and I feel comfortable in this place. And so I think there was a little bit of a juxtaposition emotionally between those two ways of feeling. To me, to be Korean means to bring the fullness of my experiences, my history, my people's history, and our history as a collective diaspora into that space, and also bring the systemic level, all of the historical events that have shaped our people and the histories of all other peoples into that space as well, while centering our diverse narratives as Koreans. And I think it's as big as that. I don't think there's any one definition of Korean. It's all of everything that has shaped our people. In terms of whether or not I ever felt resentful towards my home country, the answer would be yes. I think when I got connected with other Korean adoptees was after college. And I would say that's when my real political education probably began in this wonderful city, Chicago. We're very political here and very, I think, a lot of us are very activist oriented. And so I met a group of older women, just aunties, right? Like my friends who are older than me, who introduced me to some of our history around Korean adoption, and I started watching films and just becoming a little bit more educated. And I think probably that experience, also the experience that I had during college of having people say some things that I thought were a little like prejudiced or made me feel bad about myself as a Korean adoptee, and hearing that from Korean Americans and Koreans, and then also learning about the history of Korean adoption, I think that there was a discomfort around being around Koreans probably, and also Korean attitudes towards adoptees. And then I think just learning things like the fact that, we're not seen as, legitimate, or we're not, there's a sense where we're somehow outside of the accepted bloodline. There's a lot of things like the shame factors and stuff like that when you learn about it as an adoptee, it's hard to stomach, and it changes the perception that I think as an adoptee, at least for me, that I had of myself, and of my community. And it was like, I don't know if coming out is the right word, but it was like another deep journey of who am I as an adoptee. And as I'm meeting other adoptees, and I'm no longer the only adoptee in a setting where there's Koreans and others, now we can have a collective identity that's rooted in our history. And what is that? One great thing that could happen is just more communication between adoptees and non-adopted Koreans, and that way, through building relationships and community together, people's prejudices or resentments or fears can be lessened, and people can be more open to who other people are, right? I think many adoptees who have a negative experience with a first-generation Korean never want to talk to a Korean person again, or just disidentify. And I think for many Koreans, I've heard that they try to befriend an adoptee, or something happens and there's a wall, and they don't understand that, and so it makes them feel like the adoptee doesn't, really feel strongly that they don't want to be in relationship, and that I guess could hurt people's feelings or just deter them because they don't have to talk to adoptees, so maybe they just don't feel it's necessary anymore. To me, I think adoptees are critical might be an overstatement. We're just a part of the community, right? We are Korean. Whether or not adoptees think they're Korean, they are. We all stem from the Korean diaspora, and making space for people to identify the way that they do, I think that's the reality. We all come from the country of Korea, and so making space for us to own our narratives in that way, I think would be great. And making space for each other, I think, to have important dialogues around history, around, I think, going deeper than just a cultural connection, which I think is is really critical too, right? But a way that it's not just a one-way share out where Koreans are helping adoptees to understand their own cultural heritage. I think that's wonderful and important. But I think part of that relationship too then is learning from adoptees' experiences too. No adoptees have the same experience, just like no people do. And so I think the more that we just get to know each other, we allow ourselves to reclaim our past more deeply and more truly and fully as a people. And I think to accept that adoptees are part of the Korean narrative, and in the US part of the Korean American narrative, is to accept a broader narrative of our history as Korean people, and to complicate that narrative politically, socially, ethnically. And I think it's the reality whether or not we admit it, so we might as well just acknowledge it and see what's possible when we do more collectively.